To recap the story so far, our main characters, Moore, Easton, Winchester, Tigue, have all been part of a surprise attack by G&T units of the long-range desert group on the Italian-occupied town of Murzuk, a mission that included elements of the Free French forces out of Chad. 2 men from the 76 contingent were killed in the capture of the town and airfield, one of those being the commander of the French and the other a New Zealander, Corporal Cyril Hewson. Both would be buried outside the town. It was now time to scarper down south and let the dust settle, which it didn't. A sandstorm swept over them, which was somewhat in their favour as it masked their retreat down south. Once down in the relative safety of Free French occupied Chad, they would then assist with the larger force made up of mostly local Africans from the Free French attacking another key supply town, Kurfra. But before they got there, they would incapacitate every little oasis come hamlet they could get their grubby hands on, starting with Taragan at 30 miles southeast, one of those annoying places on any map with 3 spellings. 5 miles out of town, they ran into 2 Italian soldiers on camels minding their own business and oblivious to the goings-on in Murzuk. They were driven to the outskirts of Taragan and told to go inside the town and tell your mates to surrender, which they did, making superb pantomime out of the process. The town on their list, with multiple spellings by the way, was El Arib. Still looks like a quaint town today. Perfect spot to while away the time reading a book whilst the kids play in the pool. There they ran into fierce resistance from the Italian defenders, who had got their heads up the British were coming, and they had set up defensive positions. Another thing in the favour of the defenders were the sand dunes surrounding the town, which were almost impossible to traverse. In the end, T&G called off the attack and drove south towards Chad. The second big fish had always been Kurfra. The British would be subservient to the French on this one, an advance guard so to speak, probing the Italian defences, and then combining with the larger French force for the actual attack. The 2 units left fire on the 27th of January 1941, not knowing the enemy's strengths or the road ahead of them. Commander of the British side of the mission, Major Pat Clayton, decided to split the force. 11 trucks, including his own, from T-Force went forward probing on reconnaissance mission, and G-Force were left in reserve. Many of you will know Clayton in a roundabout way. Whilst Clayton was a compatriot of Bagnall's I covered in the first video, it's not as a pre-war desert explorer he's now best known, rather the fictional character Peter Maddox from The English Patient, based loosely on his life. Moore and a team, including John Easton, Alex Winchester and Alf Tigue, and plus an Italian prisoner, were part of that forward group in a decked-out Chev nicknamed Te Araha. An interesting choice of a nickname for a vehicle of this nature, considering it translates loosely to love. Moore was the driver of that truck, by the way. Nearing a spot called Gebel Sherif in the afternoon, they dispersed, having spotted an Italian spotter plane overhead. Awaited darkness before venturing forward. Still blows me away those vehicles and equipment reside there today, preserved by the environment, remoteness and political instability. The Italians knew the British and Free French were sniffing around, and that an attack was likely to come directly from the south. The spies down in Chad had got more exacting intel from the locals down there of the route being taken by the larger Free French force. At 3:30 that afternoon, a spotter plane was heard overhead again. T-Force soon had company in the form of their Italian equivalents, a much larger force from the Auto-Saharian Company, who was soon joined in the skies by 3 Camperoni light bombers, making low-level strafing runs. On the sand, both sides were trading bullets at just 200 metres. Kiwi Corporal Francis Beach from Picton, who was operating the machine gun on T-Row in the truck in front, was killed instantly. That gravestone really should have read the 31st of January, by the way. He probably needs to complain on TikTok. 4 vehicles from the LRDG were soon up in flames, including Te Araha, and 2 of the 4 crew, of which by now were wounded. Moore had a bullet penetrate the outside of his foot and exit via the sole. Scotsman Easton was way worse off, a piece of shrapnel having penetrated his throat. The foursome bailed and scarpered to the relative safety of the rocks, and their Italian prisoner took the time to scarper. Meanwhile, Clayton was also wounded, shot through the arm. He and 2 Kiwi companions were ultimately captured. The 7 remaining vehicles from T-Force now hightailed it, in the belief the crew from Te Araha to be similarly now prisoners of war. Once both their compatriots and the enemy had had enough of trying to kill each other, Moore and his 3 companions, Easton, Winchester and Tigue, went down to survey the scene, and they went out of danger, and dying a miserable death under the sun was now a real option. They could head north towards Italian-held Kurfra, about 100 kilometres, knowing that was the safer option, even if it meant spending the war behind barbed wire fences, or go south to friendly territory in Tikro. Only that meant trekking of 3 to 4 times that distance. Their main hope would be they would be spotted somewhere along the way. All of this knowing all they had was 1 metal tin containing 14 pints of water rescued from one of the wrecks. No food. They chose the riskier southward trek, and the foursome set forth, Moore and Easton employing what they could to readdress their injuries, making full use of that most versatile piece of men's attire, handkerchiefs. On the first day, they covered 65 kilometres. When they spotted an Italian vehicle at a discreet distance, they hid and had another discussion as to what to be made of the situation and whether they should surrender. Looking at their options, they decided to approach the truck, only to find it was a wreck and empty of anything useful. If interesting stories out of New Zealand titillate you, your subscription out here in the wastelands of YouTube would be gratefully appreciated. Forward ho! The first 3 days they travelled virtually day and night, the nights being freezing affairs, and all 4 had just what they had on just after that engagement, and 2 were in shorts, and 2 in longs, 2 with shoes and 2 without. Things became more tenuous for the group the further they went on, as Moore led the way. Ty, the bloke who had just undergone a stomach ulcer operation before starting the mission, was now the one struggling to keep up. As their morale began to go south, they got a real boost at the close of day 3, when following the truck tracks of their compatriots, a tin of jam that somehow must have fallen from a truck from T-Squad magically appeared, found in the middle of nowhere. Promptly scoffed. The next target was now only a day trek away, the oasis town of Asara that T-Force had stopped in on the way up north. When I say town, I mean some unoccupied buildings in the middle of nowhere, where they knew there wouldn't be any water, the Italians having filled in wells left, right and centre, but there would be a stock of lentils. And that's because when they had been dished up previously to the troops who spent a night there, and they had gotten the big thumbs down, now those culinary rejects were now looking like porterhouses. Let's get an overview, which reminds us all of the type of ground these 4 blokes were trudging. As a bit of an aside, an interesting one at that, viewing down on Google Earth, at one stage Sara appears to have been a Libyan Air Force base under Gaddafi. Today it looks abandoned, in a state of disrepair. Sands have begun to reclaim the runways as well as the town, which looks unoccupied. Sara was a blessing and a curse. The lentils were found, a fire was lit, however they were too dry and salty to eat raw, and they weren't going to risk precious boiling water on them. And they did manage to scrape some powdered dehydrated milk from discarded tins, and then spent a night under a roof out of the bitter wind. In the morning of day 5, the group had a decision to make. For Ty, that decision had already been made. He simply couldn't go on. felt he was dragging the group down and gallantly did a Captain Oates. He was staying and he would take his chances. Someone would come to his aid. Tigue was given his share of the water. The other three marched onwards, now at a crawl, resting every hour, and then, to make the bleak situation even worse, a huge sandstorm occurred. Then, in another act of providence, they literally stumbled upon a ruined hut where they found motor oil, which they used again to light a fire and bathe their shredded feet. On the morning of day 7, they awake to find the storm had obliterated tyre tracks they were following up to this point. Attention now went onto the injured Easton. It had become clear he was fading, lagging further and further behind, and stopping was an option at this stage. None of the three were fully coherent. On day 7, Easton was left with his share of the water, and Moore and Winchester slogged onwards. Day 9, despite everything, both Moore and Winchester were still covering 40 kilometres a day. Intermittent delirium was now a constant companion. When in the skies above, a French spotter plane was seen by the pair. More importantly, the plane had spotted them, dropping a bottle of lemonade, the cork of which, frustratingly, popped out when it hit the sand, and all they were left with was a few bubbles. The same time that was occurring, a French patrol had come across the half-dead Tigue back in Sara. My mates, go after my mates," was the first thing he told the French. Only none of them could speak English, and precious time was lost in translation. Ultimately, he told them the direction the other three were heading. With that info supplied by the plane as well, rescue was now coming north from Tekro as well. Now having crossed the Chad border, this is the point Winchester decided he would stop and await rescue. In between part 1 and 2, thanks to Charlie, you know who you are, we now have a photo of Guardsman Alexander Winchester of Glasgow. After they shed the last remaining water, Moore continued on stoically, arms characteristically swaying like a windmill. Day 10, all three would be rescued. Easton would be found on death's door. Remember, he was the bloke with shrapnel wound to his throat. He was scooted back to Sara and given a few drops of tea by the French doctor, trying to reintroduce liquids slowly due to his wounds and dehydration. Easton's last words were, "I don't usually take sugar with my tea." Guardsman John Easton from Manchester died on the 12th of February 1941, aged 22. He is buried at Knightsbridge Cemetery in Acroma, Libya. There's been a lot of concern lately. This Commonwealth cemetery has been left to wreck and ruin given the collapse of any form of stable government. The afternoon of day 10, the first of the last two would be rescued. Guardsman Alexander Winchester of Glasgow. Last was Corporal Moore, 15 kilometres southward. This isn't, of course, the only video on this march. A remarkable tale of survival that was a propaganda boom for the Commonwealth papers. In my amateur contribution, I've done my best to add to the side stories and delve more into the overall operation, the people and nuances, like, say, the LRDG were the ones testing the Italian defences around Kurfra. They weren't the ones tasked with actually taking the town. That was down to the much larger Free French forces following in their dust. 396 of them to be exact, 295 of those being locals. And that's a picture of one of them, and he's got in his hands the Italian battalion's standard after their capture. Just one vehicle from T-Force was involved in that attack, in a navigational role only. The rest of what was left of G&T headed back to Egypt. By the time they'd completed their mission, the LRDG had covered over 7,000 kilometres of Libyan desert, lost 4 trucks to enemy action, 2 to mechanical breakdown, and by the end 2 were being towed. The casualties included 3 dead, 3 captured by the Italians. The 3 survivors spent a month rehabilitating with the French, and that meant plumping up. Moore, for example, had lost 13 kilograms over that week and a half, before ending up back in Egypt to much hoopla. Eventually Tigue would go back into the breach, so to speak. He would die in October 1944, aged 22, after stepping on a mine in Greece. It would be left to his parents to receive his DCM at Buckingham Palace, and Ronald Joseph Moore. First up, his parents were delighted he was alive and not captured, as had been published in New Zealand newspapers. Modest in the extreme, he wasn't exactly enthralled with all the attention he was getting. Received his own Distinguished Conduct Medal whilst convalescing in an Egyptian hospital January 1942 after being shot in the left leg. Don't you mean right foot? Well, no. Once he got well again after a stroll in the desert, he went back into the fray with T Unit just 3 months later, got wounded by the Germans in the opposite peg in December. What's more, earlier, just after his return to civilization, doctors had removed a piece of shrapnel lodged in his left foot, the very one he had walked on for those 10 days. What did you do in the war on COVID, Grandad? Well, I watched 12 hours of Netflix for 10 days running. End result, these wounds meant he was now deemed unfit for active service, and he was shipped back to New Zealand, where the army put him to good use, training troops in the art of desert warfare and deception, where they don't like it up him, that sort of thing. Skin, as he was known to his companions, went back and lived in his hometown Matamata when the war was over. That's a picture of him in 1974. He retired to the Bay of Islands, and he died aged 76 in 1992. Moore continued to underplay his contribution in the march that bore his name, felt it wasn't anything to write home about, and he made humour out of his limp. Said it added 5 shots to every round of golf. And what happened to Scotsman Alexander Winchester? And somewhere along the line, I forgot to add, Winchester had already had one notable escape in his military career, getting off the beach at Dunkirk. He also went back to roaming around the desert and getting himself into mischief, which I'm pleased to say he survived. He passed away in September of 1995. Thanks for your time here today. Between part 1 and part 2, this has been my biggest project to date, and your viewership is much appreciated. I hope to see you next time. Bye for now.